A guy driving home sees a sign in front of a house, "Talking dog for sale." He stops and says to the owner, "What about this talking dog then?" And the owner says, "Go to the backyard to see the Labrador Retriever." Seeing the dog and thinking this is a joke, he asks, "Do you talk?" "Yes," says the Labrador. "I discovered I could talk when young. I told the government about my gift, and in no time at all I was sitting in rooms with spies and world leaders eavesdropping. But I got tired of the jetting around, so I decided to retire." Well, the man is amazed and asks the owner how much for the dog. And he says, $10. "Only $10? This dog is amazing. Why are you selling him so cheaply?" And the owner replied, "Because he's lying. He never did any of that stuff." Now, of course, that's not a true story, and you knew that. However, I begin like this because this is the start of the Christmas season. And the carols we are starting to hear are saturated with the message of the gospel. Not all of them, but the message of the gospel is everywhere. And yet most people just don't get it. So what does Christmas mean? What is it all about? And one of the best ways to understand Christmas is to realise it wasn't just an event that happened out of nowhere that caught everyone off guard. It was part of God's plan that was unfolding for thousands of years. Do you remember that after Jesus had risen from the dead, he talked to his disciples, telling them they should have understood what he was going to do? He said it was in the writings of Moses, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. He said it was written in the prophets and the Psalms. Jesus was saying, this whole book has always been about me and what I would do to redeem mankind. The Bible is the unfolding of one story of how God is going to redeem sinful people from their sins. And we need to grasp this to fully experience the meaning of Christmas. So I want to go to Genesis. The word means beginnings, because we can understand everything that Christmas is about without even leaving the first book in our Bible. Now, the question asked is, how do we know that we're not just reading into those stories? That's a good question, because we don't want to read all kinds of stuff into those texts that God didn't intend. Well, every incident we are about to look at in Genesis that I'm going to say is a picture of what Christ would later come and do has a New Testament passage supporting it, saying this is true. So we're not making this up. We can go to those New Testament passages and they quote Genesis. And we begin with Genesis 2. The heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished this work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. God had spoken the universe into place, and on day 7, God rested. Was he exhausted because it's hard work creating the universe? Of course not. All God did was speak, and they didn't exhaust God. The point that God rested is repeated in such a way we might say, okay, I get it. God rested because the work was done. God rested because the work was done. God rested because the work was done. It says it 3 times. Why hammer this home? Because this is a big concept and we benefit if we understand it. It became the foundation for the Sabbath day, and what the Sabbath day represents is so important to get the message of Christmas. God finished the work, and then what? God rested. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Moving into Genesis 3 is the account of the fall of mankind. God created a perfect paradise, placing Adam and Eve in it. And this is the first statement of God's grace in the Bible. Even before sin enters the picture, there is grace, because God located them there. Adam and Eve didn't earn paradise. They were placed in paradise in an act of God's unmerited favour. But what happened? These humans failed. The serpent comes planting doubts. Maybe God is not as good as you think he is. You could be settling for less than you deserve. And it gets them wondering, is this true? Maybe we can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. And Adam and Eve chose to disobey God and immediately became aware of their own nakedness before God, and the shame of their sin causes them to try hiding from God. Genesis 3 is a tragic chapter because Adam and Eve are then put out of paradise because of their sin. But during this tragedy, God speaks to the servant, and listen to the first hope of humans' redemption. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. God speaks to the serpent. You think that you have won, but through the seed of a woman, meaning a man, will come one whom you will bruise on his heel, but he, the seed of the woman, the man, will crush your head. What is God saying? I will do whatever is necessary for sinful people to once again go back to paradise. I will bring life from death. Did Adam understand this? Yes, I think he did. Because in verse 20, Adam names the woman Eve, which means mother of the living. What an odd name for Eve. But because Adam and Eve have sinned, the consequence of their sin is death. And they have begun a process of dying. So Adam should have named her Mother of the Dying, because that was the case. Why did Adam name her Mother of the Living? Well, because Adam understood that God said, I will do what is necessary. I made a promise to bring life out of death. Adam is saying, I believe that. So I'm naming Eve Mother of the Living, because God will bring life from death. Furthermore, verse 21 is the first time there was death in all of eternity. But it wasn't Adam and Eve who died. It was a substitute, shedding its blood so that the shame of their nakedness could be covered. Now, we start getting the picture here. An animal substitute shed its blood to cover the shame of sin. Do we see the little hints of what is to come? And moving to Genesis 12, God calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and through him would come a promised man. God says to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. And whatever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So in Genesis 3, it promises the seed of a woman will be the way forward for fallen people. And now we see that through the line of Abraham, all families of the earth will be blessed. And how does the New Testament begin? Matthew opens with this. This is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew takes us all the way back saying Jesus is a son of Abraham, just as God had promised. And the event fills out with more detail in Genesis 15. God restates the special covenant promise to Abram, later called Abraham. You will have a son, and through this son will come the promised seed. Chapter 15, verse 6 is a very important verse. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. That's an accounting term meaning credited righteousness. This is the conversion moment for Abraham. And the Apostle Paul writes a lot about this in Romans, explaining that Abraham wasn't saved or declared righteous because of anything that he did other than his faith. He believed when God made his promise. But Abraham was struggling with his insecurities and asked, God, how can I know that this is going to happen? Now, I don't think he is questioning God as much as he is questioning himself. God, we are entering into this covenant, but what if I fail? How can I know that this will come to pass? And God says, Abraham, we're going to cut a covenant. Get a ram, heifer, goat, pigeon, and a turtle dove. And then he did something that would have been very common to the people in the ancient Near East, but uncommon to us. God said, I want you to cut them in half and lay the halves so that they face one another. They would do this on the side of a hill so that the blood runs down into a trough at the bottom, creating a pool of blood. Two people who were entering into the covenant, usually two kings, would walk through the blood and it would splash up on their ankles and legs. And with this act, they were saying, if I fail to keep my part of the covenant, this is what you may do to me. Today we hear a lot about making the deal, the art of the deal. They talked about covenant cutting. And God has Abraham lay this all out, and then the writer is careful to say that Abraham wasn't just asleep. He was in a deep sleep. In other words, Abraham was resting as God was working. Do we get this? It's God alone pictured as a flaming torch in a smoking oven who walks through the blood. That was God's way of saying to Abraham, this is all about me. And if you fail to keep the covenant, it will be my blood shed to make it right. That was God's promise to Abraham. And don't we hear that language in the New Testament? What did Jesus say on the night he was to be arrested? He held up the vessel with the Passover wine, saying, "This is my blood." In other words, Jesus was saying, this is the fulfillment of the promise that I made to Abraham, that because of your inability to keep the covenant, because of your sin, I am now going to shed my blood to make it right. And isn't the New Testament full of statements saying that without the shedding of blood, the blood of Christ, there is no forgiveness of sin? So, you see this was God's promise. It would be a seed of a woman that would crush the head of the serpent, triumphing over sin and bringing life out of death. And the seed of that woman would come through the line of Abraham and a particular man. But now we're told that he would be a God-man who would shed his blood alone for sin. Did Abraham understand this? Yes, I believe he did. Because when Jesus talked to religious leaders, what did he say? Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. So Jesus affirmed that Abraham did understand and believed. And what was the outcome? It was credited to his account as righteousness. And for thousands of years, every day at 3 o'clock, the priest would bring an animal to the altar and sacrifice it. And the blood would flow over the rocks. The priest understood that the blood of that animal wasn't adequate to atone for sin, but was symbolic of God's promises that he would shed his blood for the forgiveness of sin. So they understood that sacrifice to be just a symbol of the promise God made to Abraham, fulfilled in Jesus. And several New Testament passages affirm that Jesus was the promise fulfilled that was made to Abraham. Now, moving into Genesis 16, Abraham and Sarah have a crisis of faith. They are getting on in years. You know you're getting old when the candles cost more than the cake. People say age is just a number, but in some cases it's a pretty big number. It was for Abraham and Sarah, and they have no sons. They begin to think it's not going to happen and decide to produce their own plan and have Abraham have a son through the maid. That creates a big mess. God comes back in Genesis 17 saying, no, this promised seed is going to come through you and Sarah. I promised, and I will keep my promise. And Abraham believes that. But there was a reason for their concern. You see, by the time Isaac was born, Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 years old. Isn't that a little beyond childbearing years? To have a child at that age is, well, it requires a miracle. So it would have to be God's gift. And that was God's plan. He wanted Abraham and Sarah to reach a point where they would understand that this would have to be something that only God could do. So Abraham believed that, and God said, okay, to confirm that you believe this, we are going to establish a covenant sign. And that sign will be circumcision. And the symbolism goes all the way back to Genesis 3. That there would be a seed of the woman that would come through the line of Abraham, which will be God in flesh. And he would shed his blood for our inability to keep the covenant. And so the symbolism was on the male organ through which that seed would be passed. The removal of the flesh of the foreskin was a way of saying there is no ability in their flesh to accomplish this. The discarding of that flesh was a way of saying we die to a belief that we can do this ourselves. Therefore, we believe it will have to be a miracle from God. That was the symbolism of circumcision, the covenant sign. And for thousands of years, the Jewish people practiced that as a sign that said, we believe this promised seed will be a miracle from God because we have no ability in our flesh to make it happen. It will have to be all of God. Both circumcision and the Sabbath were instituted into the life of the people to understand, to grasp that this must be all of God. When God gave the law to Moses, it included a Sabbath day. This was one day out of 7 set aside to rest. And why rest? When these people stopped working on the Sabbath day, the primary meaning was the symbolism. On this day we cease from our works believing that God will do the work for us, and we rest in that. They were going back to the promise of Abraham when God said, I will do the work, all you have to do is to trust me. And for thousands and thousands of years, once a week, they would stop working. Not because their work was done, but because they believed that God would do his work and they would rest in that. The Sabbath day was symbolic of that meaning. The writer of Hebrews talks about the Sabbath. Do we today still have a Sabbath day? The answer is yes. Oh, really? What day is it? Well, it's today. Oh, do you mean Sunday? No, I mean today. It's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday and Saturday. The writer of the Hebrews says that today is the Sabbath day now, because it's the day where we cease from our own works and rest in what God has completed for us. There is a Sabbath day for us, and it's today. Because when I experience salvation, I cease from my works and I accept what was finished and completed on my behalf. This is why Jesus said, come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So, is there a Sabbath day? Yes. It's today. It's not that we don't obey that command, it's that we have entered it. We live in the completion of the fulfillment of that command. Every day is our Sabbath day, because every day we rest in the finished work of Christ on the cross. Now, what is interesting is that by the time Jesus came to earth, the Jews had taken both the practice of Sabbath keeping and the practice of circumcision and turned them upside down to where they represented the exact opposite of what God originally intended. You see, both circumcision and Sabbath keeping were meant to be symbolic of the fact that we can't do any work to merit righteousness with God. It must be done for us by God. And yet they had turned that upside down to where both circumcision and Sabbath keeping became an actual work for salvation. And when Jesus walked among them, he called them out on both of those, saying, "You've completely lost the meaning." And now, moving into Genesis 22 is that great account of obedient faith, where God calls Abraham to offer Isaac, this promised son, on the altar. Now, Abraham knew that Isaac was the one through whom the promised seed would come. The writer of Hebrews tells us that Abraham believed that he would have to sacrifice Isaac and God would raise him from the dead. And he was willing to obey. So he took Isaac up on the mount, put him on the altar, and just before he plunged the knife in him to shed his blood, God stepped in saying, "Abraham, I know now you trust me." They looked over and there was a ram caught in the thicket. So rather than Isaac dying that day and shedding his blood, it was the substitutionary ram that died in his place. Abraham understood the imagery because he named the place, "The Lord will provide the lamb." Can you hear the symbolism? It would be a father who would sacrifice his son, only it would be a substitutionary sacrifice that would die in Isaac's place. That's why when Jesus began his public ministry with John the Baptist pointing to him and saying, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." This was the fulfillment of Genesis 22. Jesus was that substitutionary lamb. And finally, in Genesis 28, there was heavenly access. There is Jacob's vision of a ladder that reached from the earth to the heavens, and the angels were ascending and descending on the ladder. And it was Jesus, in his conversation with Nathanael, who said, "I am that ladder. It will be upon me that the angels will ascend and descend. I will be the connection between sinful man and a holy God." He said the same thing in the upper room the night he was arrested. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but through me." There is only one connection point between God and man. Jesus was the fulfillment of what Jacob saw in that dream. And ultimately, this is what Christmas is all about. It's God's promise that through the seed of a woman which would come through the line of Abraham, that man will be God in the flesh. And he would shed his blood. And it was because of our inability to help ourselves and because of our sin that it would be a substitutionary death in our place. As God the Father would give up his Son because we can't save ourselves. Just as Abraham and Sarah couldn't produce a child in their old age and they had to believe that God would do for them what they could not do for themselves, we discard any idea that in our own flesh we can somehow merit righteousness before God. We throw away that belief and we believe that God will do that for us. We will live in the constant fulfillment of the Sabbath, of realizing that today is the day of Sabbath rest. We cease from our own works of self-righteousness and we rest in what God has done for us on the cross. That is why when Jesus hung on that cross, he said, "It is finished." The language of that statement is close to the language of Genesis 2. The work which God had done was completed and he rested. That is the message of the cross. The work was finished. And when Jesus completed it, he went back to the Father. He rested. And we enter that rest when by faith we believe that Jesus did for us what we could not do for ourselves. By grace you are saved through faith, that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works. That is the message of Christmas. It's the fulfillment of the promises that God made in Genesis. This was God in the flesh. That is why the angel said, "Today in the town of David a Saviour has been born to you. He is Christ the Lord." Do we want to celebrate Christmas? Of course we do. But the only way to really celebrate Christmas is to celebrate with a heart of humility. We must understand we are lost sinners in need of a Saviour, but there is something within our heart that makes it hard to admit we can't do it ourselves. The gospel is simple, but it's not easy. There is something within us that says, somehow I can win God's favour. Somehow I can jump through enough religious hoops that God will be pleased with me and that will get me to heaven. But the message from Genesis to Revelation is no, I can't. I must believe that Christmas is absolutely necessary because I can't save myself. And therefore there was a substitutionary lamb, God in flesh, who shed his blood so that my sins could be forgiven. And I can have an eternal relationship with him. That is the beginning of Christmas. There's a lot of different things that we can choose to give value to. But there is only one thing in the world that will ever satisfy the void and the desire in our soul, and that's Jesus Christ. And that's the whole hope of Christmas. And he has come and he has given his life as a gift so that we can have a relationship with him. So I must ask, like the shepherds who heard about Jesus and went to find out for themselves, don't leave here having only heard about him. Meet Jesus yourself. Choose to know the gift given to us through Jesus and tell somebody else about our choice. That will underline it for us. That's the way to a blessed beginning to Christmas.